Check out today's work of fan art. As you can see, it's Kama, looking quite wicked, which is absolutely perfect for today's video. I love the contrast, with much of the scene being in shadow, minus the heavy rim lighting. Thank you so much, Usagi Mark. Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun, Dai here. Today's video is brought to you by $50 patron NepSpartan759, who asked me to review the saga of Tanya the Evil, also known as Youjo Senki. It's a military fantasy isekai featuring a devilish loli fighting her way through a pseudo-European world war, using both strategy and powerful magecraft in an attempt to secure a comfy living away from the front lines. Normally, this is not the type of anime I would ever choose to watch on my own. From a cursory glance, Youjo Senki glorifies the aesthetic of a World War-era Germany through the eyes of a grown man in a little girl's body. It's filled with warmongering patriotism from what some have assumed was basically a lowly Hitler. It's every SJW's nightmare, and while I couldn't care less about political correctness, the anime just didn't seem to be up my alley. Same went for DS Ire, a visual novel starring literal Nazis. Youjo Senki seemed ugly and grim, especially from promotional artwork like this. It's because of this impression that I'm thankful for NepSpartan suggesting I actually watch the show, as doing so has completely changed my perception of it. Overall, the saga of Tanya the Evil is a well-animated spectacle that proves to be deeper than mere fuel for military fetishists. Perhaps its greatest flaw is that it's not complete yet. Between a 12-episode series and a feature film, Tanya's anime run ends without covering all the materials in its novel source. Nonetheless, what is here is compelling both visually and audibly. Despite its obvious real-world influence, the building of Tanya's world makes it unique with an approach to combat through mages that fly above the battlefield and fire spells with their rifles. While I much prefer the way this is handled in Izetta the Last Witch, I don't see the need for a competition, as Tanya offers plenty of quality on its own. Normally, this kind of series lends itself well to dubbing, as logistically none of the characters would be speaking Japanese, but I stuck with sub to be weary of the fact that this show's dub is not only handled directly through Funimation, but it also stars Monica Rial as the titular Tanya. While I have no gripe with her talents as a voice actress, and feel that she's actually a decent pick for the role, I'm not really impressed by how she and Funimation have been behaving as of late. As much as I can separate the professional drama from the actual anime, I didn't feel the need given the sub was already great, in no small part due to Aoi Yuki's feisty performance as Tanya. While the bulk of the anime clearly focuses on Tanya's military career, along with the various battles she partakes in, what I enjoyed most about the series is the theological debate that surrounds it. The narrative is steeped in themes of religious philosophy that I appreciate. I took a class on the topic in college, and very much want to share what I learned with you. You see, despite being an isekai, Youjo Senki has a rather serious premise. Tanya, in her previous life, was a Japanese salaryman who thrived in the world of business through his selfishness and lack of empathy. As such, he had no issue being the bearer of bad news as he laid off fellow employees. He had a firm belief that by adhering to rationality and following his company's rules, he would be happy and successful. Sadly, this perspective fails him one day, as he forgets to account for the fact that people, when driven to emotional distress, will not act rationally at all. One of the colleagues he laid off shoved him in front of an oncoming train. Just as his life was about to end, time stopped, and he was contacted by a voice claiming to be God. This God takes issue with our protagonist's lack of empathy and faith in the divine. It reasons that by removing him from his comfy desk job and casting him into a world ravaged by warfare, he will learn to be pious and caring. Thus, instead of letting him die by the train, the God reincarnates him in another world as Tanya, a little girl born to a struggling orphanage. Tanya takes this as a challenge from the god, whom she irreverently refers to as being X, and proceeds to live her life in this new world through the same means as she did previously, relying on structure and rationality over wishes and piety. In order to engage in an actual career, Tanya becomes a military prodigy as a gifted mage. She hopes to rise in the military enough to earn her place as an officer, with the authority to stay off the front lines. But time and time again, her efforts only push her deeper into the conflict. The major dramatic question is whether Tanya will be able to survive through these means, or ultimately succumb to God's will by becoming a devout worshipper. The clash between Tanya and this manipulative god serves to contextualize all the fighting that takes place in the story. While this god, being X, is not explicitly stated to be an all-powerful, monotheistic deity akin to the Christian god, enough parallels exist that we can use the anime to explore and analyze a handful of theological debates that have occurred over the years. Primarily, it all focuses around what is called the problem of evil, a secular observation that asks, if God is benevolent, why does he allow or even sometimes invoke evil things? Rather than being a matter of whether God exists or not, this question probes whether such a powerful being deserves to be worshipped or not. In other words, is our God worth fealty, or is he no more than an all-powerful tyrant? Our protagonist brings this very idea up when, on the verge of death, he asserts that a worthy God wouldn't have allowed him to be pushed in front of a train to begin with. He insinuates that this God is perhaps a devil, or something else altogether he names being X. After all, it seems hypocritical for a God who demands empathy to allow one of his children to meet such a brutal end. One of the most classic debates questioning God's benevolence is known as the Euthyphro Dilemma. It's an excerpt from the Greek philosopher Plato's written dialogue Euthyphro that asks a very simple yet loaded question regarding our morals. Essentially, it asks whether our moral values come from God's command, or if they exist independently and God is simply relaying to us those rules. Let's take a basic command that a God might order: love thy neighbor as thyself. If God commands such a thing, we're left to ponder whether we should love thy neighbor because God said so, or because loving thy neighbor is a good thing to do no matter what God says. Theologists often like to assert that without God, there are no morals, so how can an atheist possibly claim to be a righteous person? If God doesn't tell you not to, say, kill people, what's stopping you from doing it? The Euthyphro Dilemma turns this idea on its head, insinuating that good and evil could be concepts that exist independent from God. Believers don't like this idea, as it provides a secular form of justice that makes God unnecessary to be a good person. It implies that God is not omnipotent, and instead of deciding the morals, has to adhere to them. Our protagonist states this in the first episode, declaring that in a world as rational and scientifically advanced as his, he has no need to worship a god. This is what gives being X the idea to cast our protagonist into a world that's far less peaceful. If we return to the Euthyphro Dilemma and look at the other side, it paints an even bleaker picture. If God is all-powerful, and God's command is truly what makes something good or evil, it implies that, relative to God, morals are arbitrary. Whatever God orders to be good becomes good, which implies that God can command literally anything as morally righteous or sinful. One day, we can all wake up to a God commanding us to kill thy neighbor instead of love them. By our own belief, we'd have to accept this new command as the truth, no matter how jarring it may seem. But that just doesn't sound right. If God told you to curb stomp a puppy, would you do it? I think most normal people would refuse, instead listening to their own sense of morality rather than God's. We might think any God who commands us to do that isn't benevolent at all, but rather an evil tyrant. By the nature of the dilemma, you can't have it both ways. Either God decides our morals with the omnipotence to make literally anything good or evil by commanding it, or God isn't as omnipotent as we describe, instead having to appeal to already existing morals, else we question God's goodness. Once we begin to question God's goodness using our own moral compass, the problem of evil becomes much more pressing. Perhaps the best explanation for why God would allow evil in the world is because it's necessary for us to have free will. God wants us to be our own moral agents, and us doing good has no meaning unless we choose it over doing evil. This way, all things good and evil are caused by humanity, and any attempt to interfere with that would violate our free will. However, we can say with certainty that God does interfere with this process, with stories describing how God both blesses people and invokes his wrath upon them. It makes us wonder, if God can and occasionally does step in, why do the devout suffer? Usually it always comes back to the same pathetic answer, that God works in mysterious ways. That perhaps God has a vision for the world that required, say, your wife to die in labor, and you just don't understand the whole chain of causality. One frustrating example of this can be found in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Job. It features a pious man named Job who is blessed with wealth, peace, and children. To criticize God, Satan insinuates that the only reason Job worships God is because of the blessings he receives. If life weren't so kind to him, perhaps Job would no longer worship God. To test this idea, God allows Satan to take Job's wealth and murder his children. At first, Job remains faithful, but after Satan afflicts his body with horribly painful boils, and he is unable to end his own suffering through death, he begins to curse God. He accuses God of turning a blind eye to the world's suffering, as evildoers go unpunished while he suffers. Without addressing any of these accusations, God instead tells Job of his divine power and wisdom. It more or less comes off as, "You weren't there when I created the universe. You don't know me and why I do what I do." This causes Job to admit that, sure enough, God is more complicated than he understands, and so he returns to worshiping God. Ultimately, God does return Job's life to its previous state, but that doesn't change the fact that this biblical God was willing to subject one of his followers to traumatic loss and horrible pain just to prove a point to Satan. It sends the signal that God cares more about being worshipped than actually caring for his children. This ties right into Youjo Senki with what being X puts Tanya through. Tanya is cast into a violent world in order to learn to be pious. Being X appears to take personal offense to Tanya's atheism and continually meddles in her affairs in an attempt to change her perspective. But at what cost? Just how valuable is one single person's worship out of all the people that exist in all the different worlds that comprise Being X's authority? Sure, normally, we could blame the world's warfare on evils arising from people's free will, but Being X actively interferes with this world to provoke Tanya, in turn perpetuating the war further. For instance, Tanya is a gifted mage, and on the battlefield she's a feared killer. Being X has her promoted to even more active roles in the war, leading to further casualties considering she wanted to stay away from the front lines. In a cruel twist of fate, Being X forces Tanya to praise the Lord every time she uses her most powerful magic. In other words, Being X rewards Tanya for reluctantly praying by making her more destructive. It really makes you wonder how many hundreds of thousands of people are being killed in this world, just so Being X can stubbornly prove a point to a single person that dared to defy its will. To an extent, we're supposed to mourn the people that Tanya kills, and while Tanya does bear responsibility for her actions, so too should Being X. For instance, there's an arc surrounding a soldier named Ansun. He's one of the first people to attack Tanya early on, and is nearly killed by her later in the season. He had the chance to retire from the war and return to his daughter, Mary Sue, on account of his injuries. But instead, his faith in God empowered him to keep fighting. He too began to exhibit powers through prayer, bringing him into another battle with Tanya that he ultimately loses. In the movie, Mary Sue joins the military to get revenge on Tanya, and their respective battles are the most intense in the story thanks to Mary Sue's divine powers. So is Tanya evil? About as much as any other soldier on the battlefield, I suppose. She may not be fighting for the sake of God or justice, but she does understand that bringing the war to a decisive ending would lead to a stronger, more everlasting peace. A peace that she can't seem to achieve so long as Being X has it out for her. All in all, this is a solid anime, made better by its rich philosophical themes. There's a lot hiding behind its exterior presentation that I wouldn't have known without watching it for myself. Given all I've said, there's plenty to talk about regarding both theology and morality, so I humbly ask you all what you feel regarding these topics. In addition, have I convinced you to give the show a shot? If you've already seen it, what'd you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, help me beat the algorithm by liking, commenting, and sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and, most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of my anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content. If you want to support me directly, there are now 3 ways that all provide the same benefits. You can click Join here on YouTube, or join Patreon or Subscribestar for access to exclusive vids and early access. As always, celebrate your fandom.